Hi friends, so I went into town today with my partner, and we were outside the Parliament House in Hobart on the Parliament House lawns at 1 p.m. today. Sadly, the notice that I sent out for that particular rally for Julian Assange, or rather a sort of a snap protest you might call it, probably got out a little bit late for people because it was an impromptu idea to do one today, but we have one also for tomorrow at 1 p.m. on the Parliament House lawns outside Parliament House in Hobart. So please come and join us if you live in Tasmania. There's Alia. She's got her little bird be safe collar on. No, we don't like to dress up our cats. She likes to be in the videos. So anyway, we were there at 1, and it was just my partner and I, and we had a very, very large banner, which I'll see if I can get a photo of it and post it here. It's a Noam Chomsky quote about, you know, if you basically want to stop terrorism, there's a really easy way to do so, and that is to stop participating in it. It's a very large banner, about 10 foot by 4 foot or something. So a good anti-war banner, because we don't have any anti-war movement to speak of in Australia right now, and that's a really tragic thing. So anyway, we had that, and unfortunately we didn't have any actual. We were expecting some other people to come with some Julian Assange banners of different kinds, but unfortunately that didn't happen. So we were doing a lot of basically projecting our voices and sort of giving out messages about different things in relation to Julian Assange and what he is and what he's risked, and that he's a publisher, and that he is that this is an attack on press freedoms, and it is an attack on democracy. It's an attack on whistleblowers. It's breaking international law to kick him out of when he sought asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy. So the Ecuadorian government, Lenin Moreno, is basically breaking international law and also setting a precedent where political asylum doesn't mean anything. And interestingly enough, the IMF just recently gave Ecuador a 4.2 billion with a B, loan. So that was probably another prompting for him to actually go ahead and kick Assange out. Also, the UN rapporteur for torture was going to visit the Ecuadorian embassy to see the situation for Assange in that embassy, which was torture and has been torture for a long time, but particularly in the last 12 months. And I think he wanted to get him the hell out of there before the UN rapporteur came in and checked out the situation, which wouldn't have looked good for him. He's also up on corruption, and so basically there's also, and the US obviously has given him a lot of financial incentives to betray Assange and kick him out. So, but anyway, Julian Assange is a publisher, and he has helped expose war crimes, and he's helped expose corruption by politicians, and that's why the US wants him disappeared, either by extraditing him and putting him into solitary confinement for the rest of his life, torturing him, not giving him any sort of books to read, basically, and and the worst case scenario is if he's executed, because I've mentioned in my last video that John Bolton and Mike Pompeo are part of those psychopaths that sort of basically would probably like to see that. So, there's all those different things that could happen to him. And sorry, my voice is a bit hoarse. We were sort of basically shouting different things for about almost an hour, and we got some attention. We got some attention from across the road. There was hardly anybody in the park, but where we were standing, there was a lot of people in various cafes and outdoor pubs and things, and so we actually had some sort of an audience, and also people were driving by and they saw our banner and they were honking, occasional honks, so that was something. But anyway, hopefully there might be, I think there might be some people coming tomorrow, hopefully. I've tried to advertise this snap protest against the extradition of Julian Assange to the US on as many social media places that I can, and I hope that if you, I hope that you will post, if you're on Facebook, you'll post the event link that I'm going to put in the information section, and encourage people who live in Hobart and surrounding areas to please come down. And I'll be doing some sort of a, they might have a megaphone, and I'll try and do some sort of things through a megaphone to save my voice, but also project the message. But anyway, that's sort of all I really wanted to say, was to invite anybody in the Hobart area and surrounds to come to Parliament House, the lawns outside Parliament House, very beautiful lawns, lots of beautiful shady trees, and to join us with any sort of signs that you can, that protecting Julian Assange, protecting press freedoms, that this is an assault on press freedoms, that this is an assault on democracy, and that any journalist should care about this issue, because basically it sets a precedent that any journalist from anywhere, any publisher who is exposing any sort of corruption and war crimes of the US, can basically be extradited to the US, just like Julian Assange. And other countries might follow suit. So this is fascism is basically galloping at this point. And this is the sort of thing that Hitler used to do, get rid of, what Unity for J, Susie Dawson was talking about, the poisonous kitchen. This is, the Nazis got rid of any journalists that were trying to address them, trying to address their corruption and their whatever. So this is the same sort of thing, and they try and have a veneer of sort of like, veneer of, oh, he's only going to go for 5 years. He shouldn't be going for anything. Basically, he's basically there's nothing that he's done that is illegal, and there's nothing that he has presented via Wikileaks that is untrue. He's just exposing the truth, exposing war crimes, and that is unforgivable. He also exposed Hillary Clinton, and that's unforgivable. She literally said, "Can't we drone the guy?" That's Hillary Clinton for you. So he's made some powerful enemies through WikiLeaks, and this is what people do. When they're this is their revenge. And also the national security state does not like what WikiLeaks and Julian Assange have been doing, which is, it's nothing new, because as Lee Camp said, and when he did this protest just for Julian Assange recently, he said, there's nothing that has been done. This is that's new. I mean, the Pentagon papers were published in the New York Times and in the Washington Post, and so forth. And this is just that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks have found a different way of doing it, where people can anonymously whistleblow, and and it's on a much greater scale, with online access and encryption and the whole thing. So and they're scared out of their minds, the national security state and U.S. empire, because literally they're doing some sort of a crime every day, and politicians are doing criminal. I mean, it's a kleptocracy in the U.S. basically, and in other countries there's always corruption in governments. All governments lie, and that's why we need a free press. And this is Julian Assange is part of that free press, because we have hardly any fourth estate left. Julian Assange is one of the last remaining, along with some independent journalists, is one of the last remaining, fourth estate that's not a stenographer, that isn't just supporting empire, that isn't just supporting the perpetual warmongering. There's a lot of money to be made from warmongering, and that's why there are a lot of people that have stakeholders in the continuation of war, and also the continuation of stealing resources from other countries. And that's why they do not want somebody like Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning and so forth to be releasing hidden and secret things about the corruption and the warmongering and the planning to do wars and etc. that they do. all the internal workings of the ugly internal workings of the national security state. They do not want that to be brought to light. Governments are supposed to be working for us, but they're not. They're just our oligarchs now, a lot of people in government. And they're not interested in us. We, as George Carlin said, we don't belong to their club. So anyway, so that's what and I was very upset when I did that video yesterday. I was still upset today, but it is good when you actually put into action. When you feel upset, you turn that into anger, into positive anger, meaning action, and try and get something happening that is positive and that will in some ways awaken people. I mean, awaken people to what is happening, because a lot of people, all they get here in Australia is the Murdoch press. They don't know what's going on. And we found when we had our big banner and we were standing there today and shouting out various things, that a lot of people were actually very interested. We obviously were making sense. That's a good thing. And they were very interested in what we were saying. Even though they were right across the street, they were probably about, I don't know, 50 feet away or 60 feet away. But they could hear what we were saying. It wasn't too busy. There was cars driving by, but it was quiet enough that our voices were carrying, probably hitting against the buildings too, and that helped. And so, you know, people... You know, there was only one troll. We only had one troll that came along and was, you know, sort of saying things like, I don't know, you know, the sort of things people say. So everybody was, you know, seemed to be fairly receptive, and so that's a really great thing. But it is so sad that it takes a couple of people from some rural area coming into town to be yelling out stuff with a banner, for people to sort of like have to think about this issue. I mean, this should be something that is all the media in Australia. If this was normal and the Fourth Estate wasn't dead in Australia, all these media outlets would be outraged at what's happening to Julian Assange, because not only is it an assault on a publisher who has done nothing wrong but sort of facilitate a whistleblower who wants to leak information about war crimes that the US has been committing in Iraq and Afghanistan. You know, and the war is a crime, but you know, these sort of specific events that Chelsea Manning saw when she was doing her work in Iraq, I think it was. So you know, he's not only is he not doing anything wrong, and he was actually Wikileaks was leaking to the public in their interest real information, real true information about war crimes. But, you know, journalists everywhere, all over the world, should be concerned about their own security and safety. If the US can extradite any publisher or journalist or whistleblower who has exposed corruption and war crimes by the US, that means that they can do that to anybody, anywhere, anytime. They could take any journalist, any publisher from anywhere in the world and have them extradited. And you know that the US uses sticks rather than carrots. They also have the the NSA, which is has been collecting, you know, 90 billion emails every day from, that's billion with a B, and tapping into people's phone calls and transcribing those phone calls, you know, with algorithms. Every single day, 60 billion, I think, 60 billion voicemail, you know, voice calls. They collect that too. So 90 billion emails, 60 billion or 40 billion, something like that, voice calls, you know, phone calls. And that's what they're collecting every day. So they have blackmailing in, you know, sort of extortion type information on every politician in the world, because they spy, you know, they've spied on everybody, Angela Merkel and the whole, they have information and blackmailing material on all of us in the world pretty much, because they basically managed now to make it a massive surveillance thing. So every politician can be blackmailed and extorted. And so, you know, it would be very easy if there was somebody you wanted them to do your bidding, for example, not that this is the motivation for Juan Guaido, but if there's somebody that you want, to do something for you, basically say, look, I have this information about you, this corruption that you've done, or this whatever. They can just say that, and that's what I think. That's definitely a part of what's going on. They know that they have everybody with a little noose around their neck. So this is the thing: the national security, the NSA, and all of that. William Binney's talked about that recently in the Empire Files with Abby Martin. That's a really fascinating program, and I invite you to check it out. He talks about all of that to her, and this is what we're dealing with now. So we have to have some sort of fourth estate that exposes real crimes, real corruption, and war crimes, because otherwise, if we don't have somebody like Julian Assange and Wikileaks and people like Chelsea Manning, whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning, Daniel Ellsberg and people like that, well then, and Edward Snowden, we don't have. We are just, democracy is gone. Whatever semblance, slither of democracy there is now, it's gone. So, it's vital that we push against this. This is so dangerous now, what's happening. Imagine if you're a journalist or you're just coming out of university and you're interested in being like another Abby Martin or another Manar Muharesh from Mint Press News or another Max Blumenthal and the like, or another Julian Assange, well, then you have to worry about what might happen to you, and if you have family and so forth. You have to worry about that, because this sets a precedent. If Julian Assange is extradited to the US and they basically have a kangaroo court, put him in solitary, torture him, basically put him in solitary confinement for like 50 years, because they'll keep adding different charges onto this 5-year charge. Eventually it'll be 50 years, and they possibly could execute him. And this is all to send a message to anybody. This is what happens to you if you expose anything about the national security state, anything about the US empire. This is what will happen to you. So if we allow this to happen and we don't push back with all our might in a non-violent way, but do what we can in as many ways as we can, then we are going to have the basis of real fascism, where there will be we will not get real information, and journalists will have to go underground because they'll be in danger of being extradited or just arrested. I mean, they could just arrest independent journalists in the US. They don't need to extradite them. See, that's next on the cards, is just going in and arresting people like Chris Hedges and Abby Martin and all those sort of people, Lee Camp and everything. This is very, very dangerous, and we must act. We mustn't just sit on our hands and just, sort of like have this sort of fatigue of, oh, there's just too much happening, I can't deal with it, so I'm just going to let this go. Or if we're so obsessed with what's happening in our own country, domestic politics, I need Medicare for all. Yes, that's very important, but if you have basically no clue what's going on anymore, and then you eventually have fascists kicking down your door, because that's what it ends up being. No fascism stops somewhere, where it doesn't go any further. Eventually, you have fascists kicking down your doors. You have brown shirts wandering around, knocking people off if you're inconvenient. It's already happening in the world, in some countries, where the US has been meddling. So this is what is on the cards. This is just another step in fascism. And if we don't want to live in a world which is basically where we are frightened out of our wits, like in the Stasi state, or where we're basically, we can see that the things that we're all being clamped down upon, bit by bit, bit by bit. But this is like a gallop. This is no longer a little canter or a little trot, if I can use that analogy. This is like a gallop now, and we have to take this seriously. We can't be obsessed with just what's happening in our own backyard as long as we get free healthcare and all that kind of thing. that is not enough, because there are people's lives at stake in the Middle East who are dying. You know, 1 million dead in Iraq, children deformed from uranium-depleted bombs and all of that. People in Syria, millions and millions of people have had to flee Syria. It never stops. You know, we have to care about that. It's not enough to be just, if you call yourself progressive, which has been a co-opted term now, but if you call yourself progressive, you can't just sit on your hands and just only be interested in what's happening within, you know, the domestic politics. That is not good enough. It's not good enough. This perpetual warmongering has to stop, and it stops with you and I by us resisting that, resisting it in a real way, not in the pretend faux liberal way, in a real way. We have to start taking it seriously and care about other people in other countries. Otherwise, we're just like the rest of the we're just like in some ways the white supremacists who don't give a toss. The white supremacists, you know, alt-righters that don't really give a toss. If you were not doing anything, then we're not going out and kicking heads or anything, but if we're not doing anything, we're allowing other people, we're allowing military to go and kick heads and kill people, right? So, you know, I don't see a great deal of difference between alt-right white supremacists and us being silent and allowing this to continue. And the way to keep this from continuing is to have Wikileaks and people like Julian Assange protecting them from the national security state trying to disappear them, either by shoving them in prison for the rest of their lives or killing them, assassinating them. We have to do something, and this is the most serious assault on press freedoms, on democracy, on political asylum, you know, it's the most serious thing that's really happened in a while now, what's happening. So we have to do something. So anyway, thanks so much for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Vega. Till next time. Bye for now.
And of course now we live in an age where we've all become a sacrifice zone. The planet has become a sacrifice zone. And the question is, how do we react? This book is different from those other three in that I've stopped attempting to analyze the problem and started to analyze the solution. And the solution, I believe, is revolution. It is the overthrow of corporate tyranny. And every action that we take from now on must be to destroy that tyranny in whatever form and whatever shape it manifests itself. So I was in Boston a couple days ago, and before my talk I was with anti-fracking activists. Kinder Morgan and Spectrum are running pipelines literally through suburban centers of Boston so that the tar sands and bitumen can be exported to China. And of course they're frantic, not only for their community, but for the planet. And they kept asking, you know, we have petitions, we're appealing to Elizabeth Warren, we're appealing to Markey, and certainly coming out of this book, I said, stop. I said, the only thing you should focus all of your energy on now is buying junk cars, driving them into the streets in front of that construction equipment, taking out the battery and walking away. Every action that we take from now on must be to break the machine. There's no more collaboration because they don't listen. Young men and women can walk through the streets of American cities, young men and women of color, in these acts of lynching carried out by our militarized police forces. 2 people a day. They've lied to us. What a surprise. The Washington Post just did a story and said it's not 1 every 28 hours. It's at least 2 people a day because they don't report. It's self-reporting. They report what they want to report. Day after day, they march through the streets of American cities decrying the lethal force, the execution of unarmed citizens, and it doesn't matter how many marches take place, they keep killing. The population of this country has seen videos of fellow citizens being strangled to death and murdered by militarized police forces that are not charged. Over and over, in every single aspect of our life, the message that is sent to us by the corporate state is that we don't matter. The laws have been rewritten. The Constitution has been reinterpreted by judicial fiat, twisting its very intention. The idea that unlimited corporate cash is the right to petition the government, the refusal by the court system to stand up and halt wholesale surveillance. We are the most watched, photographed, eavesdropped, monitored population in human history, and I covered the Stasi state in East Germany. And yet it doesn't matter what we want. All the way back to the bailouts of 2008, constituent calls were 100-1 against those bailouts, and yet they went through anyway. Nobody wants corporate cash replacing the vote. Nobody wants wholesale surveillance. Nobody wants the TPP or CAFTA, which is why we are watching this utterly absurd scenario where even our elected officials are not allowed to speak about trade agreements that will eviscerate what is left of environmental working regulations and our working class. That's the game they're playing. It's a game where we don't count anymore, where it doesn't matter what our rights are, it doesn't matter what our grievances are. In the name of austerity, what they are doing to the poor and increasingly the middle class. When I sued Barack Obama in federal court over Section 21, Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, which says, overturning again a constitutional mandate, that the U.S. military will be given the power to seize American citizens who, quote unquote, substantially support, that's not a legal term, that's not material support, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, or associated forces, another nebulous term, strip them of due process and hold them indefinitely in military facilities. When they ran opinion polls on that section, it had a 97% disapproval rating, and yet it passed anyway. In the midst of that court case, we won in the Southern District Court of New York. The Obama administration appealed. We reached out to the Democratic leadership in the Congress, and we said we will drop the lawsuit if you will write into that provision that American citizens are exempt. And of course they would not do it, because it was written for American citizens, because they know what's coming. The combination of climate change, the inevitable speculation, the crash that will come from returning to the casino capitalism globally, they know what's coming, and they're preparing. And every single mechanism they use to strip us of our power mocks our democracy or the facade of our democracy. When they appealed when Obama went to the Second Circuit, the appellate court, with his appeal, which he did, they sent lawyers, Judge Catherine B. Forrest, who in her 112-page opinion, when she issued her ruling, said that this provision opens up the possibility that the government can criminalize an entire category of people and strip them of their rights, and she brought up the internment of 110,000 Japanese during World War II. And the reaction of the Obama administration was to visit her chambers, not just with federal attorneys, but now with attorneys from the NSA and the security apparatus, and demand that she lift her temporary injunction until the appeal would be heard, which to her credit she refused. That was a Friday afternoon. By 9 a.m. Monday morning, they were at the Second Circuit demanding the same thing, and unfortunately, they lifted that injunction and put the law back into effect. And why? The lawyers, Bruce Afron, Carl Mayer, and I asked why. And I think the conclusion we came to is because they're already using the law on U.S. Pakistani dual nationals in places like Bagram. And if they could ever get out and that injunction was standing, then the government would be held in contempt of court. Now, the Second Circuit, and it was a kind of window into how the court system has become a wholly owned subsidiary of the corporate state. The Second Circuit had to rule on a black and white constitutional issue. And to the credit of my old employer, the New York Times, not only did they send a reporter to follow the case, but wrote an editorial praising Judge Forrest's ruling after her decision. The question was, how were they going to maintain this violation and not have to confront the very clear constitutional mandate that the military is not to be used as a domestic police force? And what they did is kind of classic of the way the courts work. I was a plaintiff in Clapper versus Amnesty International against the FISA Amendment Act, which reached the Supreme Court. And before the court, this was before Snowden, government lawyers got up and said that the charge that I and the other plaintiffs were under surveillance was speculation, and added that if we were under surveillance, the government would tell us. And so the Second Circuit waited for that ruling, and when it came through, they said, well, Hedges doesn't have standing in Clapper versus Amnesty International, therefore he doesn't have standing in Hedges versus Obama, and they threw it out and it's law. Over and over, the system has been reconfigured into what the great political philosopher Sheldon Wolin calls our system of inverted totalitarianism. And that book, which I mentioned in almost every talk I give, Democracy Incorporated, is for me the most prescient study of the devolution and destruction of American democracy, the corporate coup d'etat that's taken place, as John Ralston Saul says, in slow motion. Inverted totalitarianism, Wolin writes, is not classical totalitarianism. It doesn't find its expression through a demagogue or a charismatic leader, but through the anonymity of the corporate state. That in a classical totalitarian regime, you have reactionary or revolutionary forces that overthrow a decaying structure and replace it. But in inverted totalitarianism, you have corporate forces that purport to pay fealty to electoral politics, the Constitution, the iconography and language of American patriotism, and yet internally have seized all of the levers of power to render the citizen impotent. We have now created a system internally that replicates the structure of any totalitarian society. Hannah Arendt, in The Origins of Totalitarianism, writes about the precursors to totalitarian power. She herself, stripped of her citizenship in Germany for helping German Jews flee to Palestine, captured by the Gestapo, almost killed, ends up in France as a stateless person. And as a stateless person, she grasps that when a society strips a certain segment of their population of rights, the way we have with undocumented workers, or the way we have with poor brown and black people in our marginal communities, and couples that with what she calls omnipotent policing, you create internally structures that at the flick of a switch can spread throughout the wider society. The reason Sacco and I went to these sacrifice zones was to say you have to look at what's happened in cities like Camden, New Jersey, or the coal fields of southern West Virginia, or the produce fields, or our Indian reservations, Pine Ridge, South Dakota, because what these forces have done in these sacrifice zones, they will do to you. If we don't grasp what's happening in places like Ferguson and Baltimore, and remember, part of what is driving these protests is not the indiscriminate use of lethal violence on the part of militarized police who can kill with impunity, but the fact that in the name of austerity, the most vulnerable of us are being exploited economically to a terrifying degree. 30 to 40% of revenue in St. Louis County comes from fines. Fines visited on the poorest among us. Fines for not mowing your lawn. Fines for standing for 5 seconds in a crowd, or fines for not standing for 5 seconds in a crowd. Fines for taillights. And if you're poor, you can't pay those fines. And if you can't pay those fines, there's a warrant. And when you're stopped for a taillight, and that warrant means you go to jail, you run and the police shoot you in the back and kill you. That's America. Over and over, these stories of dignity. A student of mine, arrested at the age of 14, poor, dragged into a police station for a knifing he didn't commit. Held in that police station till 2, 3 in the morning, weeping, the boy, told that he must sign. If he signs, he can go home. They were not allowing his family to be in the room with him. He signs, it's a confession. He spends 2 years in the county jail. He goes to trial when he's 16. He's convicted. He's not eligible to go before a parole board until he's 70 years old. I can sit here all night and tell you stories like that. What we have done in our system of mass incarceration, which is neo-slavery. What we have done to poor people of color in this country. He was my only A+ last semester, and when the class was over, the students left and he and I were alone in the room, and he said, "I worked so hard. I know I'm going to die in this prison, but I'm going to be a teacher like you." And he walked out. This book is written for them. I learn more from them than I give them. I admire them so much. Every class I teach to them is the same. It's about revolt. It's about resistance. And that's what this book is about. It's about rebellion. Because we have no time left. The climate is being, the ecosystem, degraded and destroyed at a rate that even climate scientists did not predict. The reconfiguration of the global economy into a form of terrifying neo-feudalism, the rise of a corporate oligarchic elite that cares nothing for human life. Karl Marx nailed it. Can't understand capitalism if you don't read Volume 1 of Capital. Unfettered, unregulated capitalism, which we now live under, is, as Marx said, a revolutionary force. There are no internal mechanisms of control, and now there are no external mechanisms of control, which means that they will exploit everything, human beings, the natural world, until exhaustion or collapse. And that is why the environmental crisis is intimately twinned with the economic crisis. In theological terms, these corporate forces are forces of death. And it is incumbent upon us, and I speak as a father, to stand up and affirm life, no matter what the cost. Because resistance, as my students taught me, is not about what we can achieve, it is about who we are able to become. Resistance is an act of faith, a belief that the good draws to it the good, at least the good insofar as we can determine it, and then we have to let it go. But it is the belief that it goes somewhere. The Buddhists call it karma. We have to stop asking ourselves what is practical. It's too late for that. We have to stop trusting in mechanisms of power because they have betrayed us. Every act that we make now, every decision that we make now, must be to break the machine, including all of the political mechanisms that are used to mask venal corporate power, including the Democratic Party. I covered disintegrating societies for many years, all of the revolutions in Eastern Europe, the two Palestinian uprisings or intifadas. Viscerally, my anger at Bernie Sanders, intellectually it stems from his decision to run as a Democrat, but emotionally it stems from his refusal to stand up for the Palestinian people. Because we live in an age where we are going to stand with all of the oppressed or none of the oppressed. In the face of corporate tyranny, we cannot pick which oppressed group is convenient to support and which is not. Because it is the language of oppression, it is the experience of the oppressed that will teach us how to resist, and that will give us the honesty and the courage to fight back. It is, and I learned this overseas as a white male and an American, it is a curse to have privilege. This is the theme of King Lear. Because you are blind, privilege blinds you. You cannot see, you cannot understand. You become self-deluded the more privileged you become. And as our society devolves, the harsh and brutal mechanisms of control on the outer reaches of empire migrate back into the heart of empire. So a night raid in Oakland for a nonviolent drug offense looks no different than a night raid in Fallujah. Militarized drones, wholesale surveillance, tanks on the city streets of Ferguson against unarmed young men and women. That is the disease of empire, the disease that is eating at the very core of our society. And as the country sinks under the weight of a corporate oligarchic class, as the assault on the middle class continues, the assault on the working class, of course, is over. As they run out of poor black and brown bodies to put in cages, because, as Marx understood, surplus labor is worth nothing to capitalists on streets, but it generates $40,000 or $50,000 a year when you put a person in a cage. And that's why they're there. It has nothing to do with crime. Because the real criminals run the country. From Wall Street to the Pentagon, in suits and uniforms. Because if you're poor in this country and you run out of a store with a package of Pampers and a six-pack, you get shot in the back or locked away for a couple years. But if you work for Goldman Sachs and you defraud poor people through subprime mortgages of hundreds of millions of dollars, you sit on trustee boards at Stanford University. I don't even know why poor people even try to commit crime. White people who look like me have nailed it. They're the finest criminals in the face of the earth. Not to mention the most efficient killers. Everything that we have done to the weak and the vulnerable, starting with African Americans, and as Faulkner knew, the original sin of this country was slavery, and it's still with us today. What we have done to Native Americans is still with us today. What we are doing to Iraqis, Afghanis, Pakistanis, Somalis is a continuation of the murderous pillaging and plundering that the white race has been on for 500 years. But the game is up. The game is up. And as Marx understood, in the final stages of capitalism, those forces pillage the very structures that make capitalism possible. And so we are seeing corporations feed off of the body politic, arms manufacturers. We spend about, we don't know, it's secret, $100 billion a year on intelligence, read surveillance, And 70% of that work is done by corporations like Bose, Allen, Hamilton, and others. The complete fusion of corporate and state power. The assault on public education. Anytime hedge fund managers become overly concerned about poor city schools, it's not because they want to teach people to read and write. It's because they know the US government spends $600 billion on public education and they want it. And along with it, they want to break the back of the teachers' unions. And shove standardized testing down the throats of our children because they do not want them to be taught how to think. They want them to be taught what to think. We have to stop sitting here and taking this stuff. We have to recognize that all of these systems are designed to crush us, and that it's time to rise up. It's time to resist. And we have to stop worrying about whether or not we can succeed. It's too late for that. Maybe we will not. I read climate change reports, many of you do. Even if we stopped all carbon emissions today, the effects of climate change stored in the oceans would be catastrophic. March, first month since we've recorded weather patterns, 400 parts per million carbon emissions every single day. There is no time left. And of course, the decision by the state to bombard the airwaves with effective propaganda is a form of disempowerment. A collective self-delusion, the insane positivism that reality is never an impediment to what we desire. You get it from Hollywood, from Oprah, from positive psychologists, from the Christian right. And it's all a lie. What will resistance look like? In the book, I spend time with those I admire: Mumia Abu-Jamal, Julian Assange, Jeremy Hammond, Lynn Stewart, all of those figures endowed with what the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr calls sublime madness. And Niebuhr writes that in moments of extremity, a moment of radical evil, to take a line from Kant, it is only those endowed with sublime madness, with the capacity to stand up against overwhelming forces of oppression, that will open the door for the rest of us. Revolution. Revolution, despite the popular perception, is always nonviolent. Because, as the great theorists of revolution, Crane, Brinton, Davies, and others understood, no state is overthrown until the organs of internal security, or significant portions of them, defect. The Cossacks in Petrograd, sent in to quell the blood riots, they refuse. They fraternize with the crowd. They rush the Tsar back from the front, and he abdicates in a railway carriage before reaching Petrograd. 1979, the Shah flees Iran. His armed forces, equipped, trained by the US military, lay down their weapons and do not fight, much like the Iraqi army. Somoza, Carter turns back, the 3 ships filled with weapons, they do not fight. I was in East Germany, and Erich Honecker in the fall, September 1989, sent down an elite paratroop division to fire on the crowds of demonstrators in Leipzig, and they refused, and Honecker lasted another week in power. It is the capacity to stand up, and in the words of Václav Havel in his great 1978 essay, The Power of the Powerless, to stand up and speak an undeniable truth to power. And the state fears that truth because they know internally how gamed and corrupt the system is themselves. And that is what we are called to do. The power of the powerless, Havel writes. The power to live in truth. The power to speak and exist and resist in a way that responds to the reality around us, rather than a manufactured reality they create in order to disempower us. That capacity to live in truth, that sublime madness, Niebuhr writes, in moments of extremity. Liberalism, he says, is too weak, too ineffectual, too intellectual in order to respond to radical evil. It's only that sublime madness. And these rebels become vital. Ironic points of light, Auden calls them, Snowden and others, because they allow us to see, they keep alive another narrative, and they give us hope, because if you don't resist, you cannot use the word hope. I don't know if we will succeed. To promise success is a false promise. America is a very violent nation. We have a long history of white vigilante violence that goes all the way back to the slave patrols, right up to Clive Bundy's ranch. Thousands upon thousands of African Americans, Native Americans, dissidents, labor leaders. America carried out the bloodiest labor wars in the industrialized world. Hundreds of American workers lost their lives so that we could have a 40-hour work week and an 8-hour day and an end to child labor. Don't talk to me of the military. Those are our patriots. Those are those who stood up to make this country a better place and died for it. And many of them were blacklisted, tens of thousands, gunned down by white vigilantes, Baldwin Felts, Pinkertons, gun thugs. And they're there, our fascists, our gun-toting Christian right militia members who function the way fascist groups always function, diverting a legitimate rage, and it is legitimate, against the vulnerable, undocumented workers, Muslims, homosexuals, feminists, intellectuals, liberals. And they're strong and powerful, and we at this moment, because our movements were destroyed in the name of anti-communism, are starting almost from zero. And yet, as Howard Zinn understood, every opening in American democracy came from radical movements. The Liberty Party that fought slavery, the suffragists, the labor movement, the civil rights movement. The mythology we use to describe the New Deal is not history, because those radical movements, including the Communist Party, went to Roosevelt and said, either you put people back to work, you feed the destitute and the elderly, or you get revolution. And Roosevelt and oligarch himself went to the other elites and said, you better give up some of your money now or you may lose all of your money. And as Roosevelt said, he said his greatest achievement was that he saved capitalism. But it's time for capitalism to go. And it's only going to go if we make it go. And that means that we have got to build movements that are unrepentingly antagonistic to every aspect of corporate power. And that has as its goal, whether it's our for-profit healthcare system, or the destruction of education, or the arms industry, or the looting and pillaging by Wall Street, every action must be directed to dismantling the structures that oppress us. And that will come only by building movements that grasp that it is not our job to take power. Power is the problem. Karl Polanyi in The Open Society and Its Enemies says, the question is not how do you get good people to rule, that's the wrong question. Polanyi said, most people attracted to power are at best mediocre or venal. The question is how do you make the powerful frightened of you? That is the only question. Because as Frederick Douglass understood, that is the only way power responds. Including that ridiculous movie about Lincoln. How can you make a movie about emancipation without Frederick Douglass? Only in Hollywood. There's a scene in Kissinger's memoirs, do not buy the book. So it's 1971. And Nixon, remember our last liberal president? Yes, he was. Not because he had a conscience or he was liberal, but because he was frightened of movements. OSHA, Mine and Safety Act, Clean Water Act, all came from Nixon. And he's standing at a window at the White House, and he's taken empty city buses and put them end to end around the White House, and he's looking out the window and he says, "Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us." And that's where people in power have to be. That's just where they have to be. And it's our job to put them there. And if you look back at American history, every leap toward justice and equality was made by movements that frightened the powerful. Julian Benda, the treason of the intellectuals. We have a choice in life between serving two sets of principles, privilege and power, or justice and truth. But every concession we make to those who serve privilege and power diminishes the capacity for justice and truth. We must hold fast to the moral imperative of justice and revolt. We must stand up. Because finally, revolt in an age like ours is about the capacity to affirm life itself. I do not fight fascists in the end because I will win. I fight fascists because they are fascists. Thank you very much.